The tooth weighed 3 pounds. I held it in both hands the morning they pulled it from the hull timber, and it was heavier than a man's heart, pale as old bone, serrated along both edges like a saw blade, and as wide across as my open palm from thumb to little finger. It had broken off flush with the wood, buried 6 inches deep in English oak that was 4 inches thick. Whatever had driven that tooth through our hull had done so with the ease of a man pushing his thumb through wet paper. Captain Aldous held it up to the lantern light that evening and turned it slowly, and nobody spoke. We all saw the same thing. We all understood what it meant. A tooth that size did not belong to any shark that natural philosophy had ever recorded. The men who study such things, the men in their London offices with their books and their preserved specimens in jars of spirits, they would have told us we were mistaken. They would have said the largest shark in the sea is the basking shark, a plankton feeder, harmless as a cow. They would have said the white shark of the southern waters grows perhaps 20 feet, maybe 25 in exceptional cases. The hole in our hull was 9 feet across. I've kept that tooth for 52 years. It sits on my writing desk now, here in this room in Portsmouth where I will shortly die. The doctors say my lungs are finished. Too many years of salt air and pipe smoke and whatever mold grows in the belly of a ship. I can feel the truth of it every time I draw breath. There's a rattling in my chest that reminds me, if I let it, of the sound our hull made when it groaned under the pressure of something rising from beneath us. I am 81 years old. Every man who sailed with me on the Portia in the autumn of 1781 is dead. Some died that voyage. Some died in the years after in ways I will describe when I come to it. I am the last, and I have decided that the truth of what we encountered in the deep Atlantic deserves to exist somewhere other than inside my failing body. I tried, in the years after, to tell this account to the Admiralty, to the Royal Society, to anyone who might listen with the authority to investigate, or at least to record. I was dismissed. Politely at first, then less politely, then not at all. A retired sailing master spinning tales of sea monsters. They had heard it before, they said. Every old sailor has his Leviathan, but they had not held the tooth. They had not seen what I saw on the 15th of October, 1781, when the sea itself seemed to open beneath us and something from an older world rose up to feed. My name is William Pardo. I served 38 years in the Merchant Marine and 12 before that in His Majesty's Navy. I am not a superstitious man. I do not believe in mermaids or kraken or the ghosts of drowned sailors. I believe in what I have seen, what I have touched, what left its mark on timber and flesh and memory. This is my account. The Portia was a merchantman, 240 tons burden, bound from Bristol to Kingston, Jamaica, with a cargo of textiles, iron goods, and 53 casks of Worcestershire ale that the plantation owners apparently could not live without. She was not a remarkable vessel. Built in 1766 at the Simon's Yard in Bristol, she had made the Atlantic crossing 11 times before our voyage and had proven herself a steady, if unspectacular, sailor. Her hull was English oak, copper-sheathed below the waterline as was standard for vessels in the Caribbean trade, and she drew 14 feet fully laden. Our complement was 24 men, which was generous for a ship of her size, but reflected the general unease of the times. The American War was in its 6th year. French and Spanish privateers prowled the shipping lanes, and even a humble merchantman needed enough hands to work the guns if it came to that. We carried 8 6-pounders, 4 to a side, which would not have troubled a proper warship, but might discourage an opportunistic privateer. Captain James Aldous was 46, a Bristolian born and bred, with a face like a leather purse and hands that could splice a line in the dark by feel alone. I had sailed with him twice before and trusted him the way you trust a man who has brought you through bad weather and worse seas without ever raising his voice above what was necessary. He was not warm, he was not kind, but he was competent in the way that matters when the sea turns against you, which is to say he did not panic, he did not hesitate, and he did not pretend that things were other than they were. The mate was Robert Ennis, a Scotsman from Leith, with red hair going gray at the temples and a temper he mostly controlled. Ennis was a good seaman and a poor diplomat. He drove the men hard and did not care whether they liked him for it. Most did not. But they respected him, which was sufficient. Our crew was the usual mixture, experienced men who had made the crossing before and younger ones who had not. The one I must mention, because his fate weighs on me more than the others, is Thomas Bright. Tommy, we called him, though never to his face, because he was proud in the way that young men are proud, easily wounded. He was 20 years old, a carpenter's apprentice from Redcliffe who had gone to sea because his father owed money and the family needed his wages sent home. He was good with his hands, quick to learn, and had a habit of whistling hymns while he worked that should have been irritating but somehow was not. Tommy showed me a letter his first week aboard. His younger sister Grace had written it. The handwriting was large and careful, the letters of a child practicing her script. She asked him to bring her a shell from Jamaica. A pink one, she specified. She had seen a drawing in a book and wanted one of her own to hold to her ear and hear the ocean. He kept that letter folded in his shirt pocket against his chest. I know this because I saw it there later, when there was nothing left of Tommy Bright to keep anything against. We departed Bristol on the 23rd of September, 1781, on an ebb tide and a fair southwest wind. The first 11 days were unremarkable. We made good progress down the channel, weathered Ushant without difficulty, and picked up the northeast trade south of Madeira. The weather was fine, the seas moderate, the winds steady. The men settled into the routine of the watch system. The ship found her rhythm. Everything was as it should have been. It was on the 4th of October, 11 days out, that I noticed the first wrong thing. I was on the midnight watch. The sea was calm, almost glassy. A half moon sat low on the western horizon and laid a silver road across the water that seemed to stretch all the way to the Americas. There was no wind to speak of, and the Portia ghosted along on what little remained of the evening breeze, making perhaps 2 knots. The sails hung slack. The rigging creaked softly. It was the kind of night that makes you feel very small and very alone on the ocean, when you can see the stars reflected in the water and cannot tell where the sea ends and the sky begins. I was standing at the taffrail, looking aft, when I noticed that the wake was wrong. A ship's wake at 2 knots in calm water is a gentle thing. A slight disturbance, a spreading V of ripples that fades within a few boat lengths. What I saw was different. Our wake was being disrupted. Something was moving through it, beneath the surface, close enough to the ship to catch the turbulence of our passage. I could see the water bulging, a smooth, dark swelling that rose and fell in a pattern that was not waves and was not current. I watched for perhaps 5 minutes. The swelling moved with us, keeping pace, maintaining a distance of perhaps 40 yards astern. It did not surface. It did not show a fin or a tail or any feature I could identify. It was simply a displacement of water that suggested something very large moving just below the surface. I told myself it was a whale. This was not unreasonable. We were in waters where whales were common. Sperm whales, right whales, the occasional humpback. A whale following a ship's wake was not unheard of, though I had never personally witnessed it. But whales breathe, they surface, they blow. Whatever was following us did not. I watched until the moon set, and the darkness made observation impossible. When dawn came 4 hours later, the sea was empty. I mentioned it to Captain Aldous at breakfast. He listened without expression, chewed his salt pork, and said, "Probably a whale." "It didn't breathe," I said. "Then probably a current disturbance. The water's deep here. Strange things happen in deep water." He took a drink of his coffee. "Don't mention it to the men. They'll have us chased by sea serpents by supper time." I said nothing more. He was probably right. The ocean is vast and old, and it does strange things with light and water and the expectations of tired men standing watch in the dark. The next night, the 8th of October, Ennis saw it too. He came to me at the change of the watch, his face tight. "There's something following us," he said, not a question, a statement. "I've been watching it for 2 hours. It's keeping station 50 yards off the port quarter, just below the surface." "How large?" He hesitated. Ennis was not a man given to hesitation. "I can't be certain," he said. "The water displacement suggests... I don't know. It's difficult to judge size from displacement alone." "Guess?" He looked at me for a long moment. 60 feet, he said. "Maybe more." "A whale, then?" "It hasn't surfaced in 2 hours, William. Not once." We stood together at the rail and watched. The moon was fuller now, 3/4, and the visibility was better. I could see it clearly, a dark shape beneath the silver surface, moving with a slow, deliberate undulation that was nothing like the rolling motion of a whale. It was sinuous, controlled, the way a predator moves when it is not hunting but simply following, observing, learning the patterns of its prey. As I watched, the shape altered course slightly. It moved closer, not toward the ship exactly, but closer to the surface. I could see now that the body was not uniform in color. The dorsal surface was dark, almost black, but along the flanks there were lighter markings, pale stripes or scars that caught the moonlight. And the tail, when it moved, was not horizontal like a whale's. It was vertical, a slow, powerful sweep from side to side. A shark's tail. But no shark that ever lived was 60 feet long. Not in 1781. Not in any record kept by any naturalist I had ever read. The largest sharks known to science were 20 feet, perhaps 25. What I was watching was more than twice that size, possibly 3 times, and it moved with a terrible, patient economy that suggested this was not a creature accustomed to struggling for its meals. "Ennis," I said, "I see it. Don't tell the men." He looked at me with something between anger and gratitude. Wasn't planning to. We watched until it descended again, sinking slowly into the black water like a stone dropped into ink. The surface closed over it without a ripple, as though it had never been there at all. For 6 days, nothing happened. The winds picked up. We made good progress. The men went about their work. Tommy Bright whistled his hymns and practiced his knots and talked about the shell he was going to find for his sister Grace. A man named Peter Oakes, our cook, a heavy-set Welshman who had been at sea longer than I had, told stories in the evenings about his wife's garden in Swansea. She grew roses, he said, 14 varieties. She named each bush and talked to them the way some people talk to dogs, and Oakes swore they grew better for it. "She's got one called the Bishop," he told us one evening, while the off-watch crew sat on the foredeck mending sailcloth by lantern light. Dark red, almost black in certain light, won the prize at the Swansea Flower Show 3 years running. He smiled, and his whole face softened. "She wrote me to say she's trying a new variety this year, yellow. She's going to call it the Portia after the ship. Says it'll be like having me home even when I'm not." Carl Whitfield, one of the able seamen, a lean, weathered man from Falmouth, pulled out a small wooden box he kept in his sea chest. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a brass compass. Not a ship's compass, a pocket compass, the kind a gentleman might carry on a walking tour. "My boy made it," he said. "Well, his schoolmaster helped, but Daniel did the engraving himself." He showed us. On the back of the case, in the uncertain hand of a child, were the words, "So father can always find his way home." "He's 11, Carl said. "Wants to be a navigator, wants to sail with me someday." He closed the box and held it for a moment before putting it away. "I told his mother I'd be home for Christmas. She's planning a goose." These are the things I remember. Not because they matter to the story in the way that navigation and tonnage and the weather matter, but because when I tell you what happened to Peter Oakes and Carl Whitfield and Tommy Bright, I want you to know they were men. They had people who loved them. They had plans and small prides and reasons to come home. The sea took all of that. Or rather, what lived in the sea took it. On the 14th of October, 17 days out of Bristol, the Portia crossed the 25th parallel and entered the deep Atlantic. The water changed color. It had been blue-green for days, the color of the shallower continental waters. Now it turned a blue so deep it was almost purple. The ocean floor was 2 miles below us, maybe more. Soundings were meaningless. We were floating on the surface of an abyss. That night, Peter Oakes came to me with a troubled look. He'd been cleaning fish in the galley, he said. 3 yellow-fin tuna we had caught on the trailing lines that afternoon. When he opened the first one, the stomach was empty. When he opened the second, also empty. When he opened the third, he found something inside. He held it out to me. A piece of bone. Flat, roughly triangular, about 2 inches across. One edge was smooth. The other was serrated with fine, sharp teeth, like a saw blade. "That was inside the tuna?" I asked. "Lodged in its gut wall," Peter said. "The fish had swallowed it, or tried to. It was stuck partway through the stomach lining." I turned it in the lantern light. It was not a piece of bone. It was a fragment of something larger, a tooth, broken. The serrations were too regular, too precise to be anything else. "What has teeth this size?" Peter asked. I told him I didn't know. But I did know. Or I suspected. And the fragment in my hand, which I later matched perfectly to the serration pattern on the tooth we pulled from our hull, confirmed what Ennis and I had been trying not to believe. Whatever had been following us in the dark had teeth the size of a man's hand. And those teeth were designed for one purpose, which was cutting through flesh and bone with mechanical efficiency. I brought the fragment to Captain Aldous. He examined it without expression, set it down on his chart table, looked at me. "You think it's from our shadow?" he said. "I think so." "You think it's a shark?" "Yes." "William, there is no shark alive that carries teeth this size." "No," I said, "not alive." He looked at me sharply. He understood what I meant. We had both read the accounts, both seen the illustrations in the natural history volumes that every ship's officer kept in his cabin for the long watches. Fossilized teeth of enormous sharks had been found throughout Europe for centuries. The naturalists called them glossopetrae, tungstones. Some believed they had fallen from the sky. Others, more recently, had recognized them for what they were, the teeth of sharks so large they defied comprehension. Sharks that had lived in ancient oceans and died out long before man walked the earth. "Those creatures are extinct," Aldous said, "dead for thousands of years, tens of thousands." "I know what I saw in the water." "You saw a shape in the dark. You saw what you expected to see." "Ennis saw it too." Aldous was quiet for a long time. He picked up the tooth fragment and turned it in his fingers. I could see him weighing probabilities. He was a rational man, a practical man. He did not believe in monsters, but he believed in evidence, and the evidence was sitting in his hand, serrated and sharp and entirely impossible. "Double the watch," he said finally. "I want men on the bow and stern at all times, and I want them armed with muskets. If anything surfaces, I want to know about it immediately." "And the men? What do we tell them?" "Tell them we've spotted a large shark following the ship and we're taking precautions. Don't embellish, don't speculate, and for God's sake, keep that tooth fragment in your pocket." I did as he ordered. The men took the news with the practiced calm of experienced sailors. Sharks following ships were common enough. They were drawn to the garbage and waste that every vessel trailed in its wake. A large shark was worth watching, worth a musket ball if it got too close, but nothing to lose sleep over. If only they had known. The 15th of October began with dead calm, not a breath of wind. The sails hung limp as bedsheets, and the Portia sat motionless on a sea as flat and still as a mirror. The sky was cloudless. The sun hammered down with a ferocity that seemed personal, and by mid-morning, the deck planks were too hot to touch with bare feet. The pitch in the seams went soft and sticky. The air smelled of tar and salt and the faint, sweet corruption of the bilge. It was the kind of day that makes men listless and irritable. There was no work to do that the wind would not make irrelevant when it returned. The men sat in whatever shade they could find and waited. Some played cards, some slept. Tommy Bright sat cross-legged on the foredeck, carving a piece of scrap wood into something he would not let anyone see. A shell, I think now. A gift for Grace. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, the sea began to change. It started with the color. The deep purple blue that had surrounded us for days began to lighten in a rough circle around the ship, as though something very large and very pale was rising from below. The change was gradual. Over perhaps 10 minutes, the water shifted from near black to a deep blue to something almost turquoise. The circle was enormous, 300 yards across at least, centered on the Portia. Ennis was the first to the rail, then Aldous, then me. Then every man aboard who was awake, drawn by some instinct older than language to the sides of the ship, to stare down into water that was becoming, with terrible slowness, transparent. I could see it. God help me, I could see it. It was below us, directly below us, rising. The shape filled the circle of lightning water. At first my mind tried to make it a whale, then a formation of rock, somehow ascending, then a trick of the light, a refraction, an illusion born of heat and calm water and the expectations of frightened men. But it was none of those things. It was a shark of such impossible, obscene proportions that the word itself seemed inadequate, like calling a cathedral a building or an ocean a puddle. The head alone was wider than our ship. I need to say that again because even now, 52 years later, my mind recoils from the memory. The head alone was wider than the Porsche. The jaws, closed, formed a crescent that I estimated at 15 feet across, possibly more. The body behind it stretched back into the deep water and faded from visibility before I could see the tail. I could not see the tail. The creature was so large that the clear water could not reveal the whole of it at once. It was pale on its underside, almost white, with a faint mottled pattern like clouds seen from above. The dorsal surface, what I could see of it, was dark gray, the color of deep water itself, which explained why we had seen only a shadow on those earlier nights. From above, it would have been nearly invisible against the ocean floor. From the side, the lighter belly would be invisible against the bright surface. Perfect camouflage. A predator designed by God or the devil or whatever force shapes such things to be invisible until the moment it chose not to be. It rose slowly, not rushing, not attacking, rising with the patience of something that has never in its existence needed to hurry. The water between us and the creature compressed, and I could feel the ship begin to respond. A gentle lifting, as though we were being raised on a swell. But there was no swell. The sea was flat. We were rising because the water beneath us was being displaced by something ascending from below. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 24 men stood at the rails of the Porsche and looked down into the face of something that should not have existed, and not one of us made a sound. The silence was so complete I could hear the ship's timbers creaking under the unnatural pressure. Then Carl Whitfield said, very quietly, "Mary, Mother of God." And the creature opened its eye. One eye, the left eye, the one facing upward toward us. It was black and round and larger than a barrelhead, and it moved. It tracked. It saw us, not the ship. Us. I felt its gaze pass over me the way you feel the sun pass behind a cloud, a change in pressure, in temperature, in the fundamental quality of being observed. It knew we were there. It had always known. And now, for the first time, it was letting us know that it knew. The eye held us for perhaps 30 seconds. Then, the creature began to descend, slowly, with the same terrible patience with which it had risen. The turquoise water darkened back to blue. The blue deepened to purple, the purple went to black, and the shape faded, degree by degree, until the sea was opaque again, and there was nothing below us but 2 miles of dark water and the memory of what had looked up from within it. Captain Aldous was the first to speak. His voice was steady. His hands were not. "All hands to stations," he said. "Muskets loaded, swivel guns charged, every lantern we have lit and ready." "Captain," Ennis said, "muskets won't—" "I know what muskets won't do, Mr. Ennis." Aldous turned from the rail. His face was gray. "But the men need something to hold. Give them something to hold." He looked at me. In his eyes I saw what I felt in my own chest, a vast and helpless understanding that we were not at the top of any chain out here, that we floated in our wooden shell on the surface of a world we did not understand, and the things that lived in that world were older and larger and more patient than anything our philosophies had imagined. "How fast can she make in this calm?" he asked me. "With sweeps, maybe half a knot. Captain, that thing could—" "I know what it could do." He cut me off, not with anger, with the controlled, precise tone of a man who is managing his own terror one sentence at a time. "It didn't. It surfaced and it looked and it descended. It could have struck us from below and broken our keel like a twig, and it didn't. Why?" I had no answer. None of us did. "It's curious," Tommy Bright said. We all looked at him. He was standing at the rail still, looking down at the water where the creature had been. His face had an expression I could not read. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to awe. "It came up to look at us," Tommy said, "like we look at fish in a pond. It wanted to see what we were." "Then it's seen us," Aldous said. "And now it knows." "Knows what?" Ennis asked. Aldous didn't answer. He didn't have to. We all understood. The creature had risen from the deep and studied us and descended again, and now it knew everything it needed to know about the wooden thing floating on its ocean. Our size, our speed, our depth in the water, the sound we made. The waste we trailed. the number and size of the creatures moving on our deck. It had studied us the way a man studies an animal before deciding whether it is worth the effort of killing. The wind did not return that day. The Porsche sat motionless through the long, hot afternoon and into the evening, and every man aboard watched the water and waited. The muskets were loaded, the swivel guns were charged with grape. Every lantern and candle on the ship was lit and hung over the sides because someone had suggested that light might discourage the creature, and nobody had a better idea. The lights turned the water around us into a pool of amber glow. We could see perhaps 20 feet down. Beyond that, darkness. And in that darkness somewhere, a creature that could swallow our ship's boat whole waited with the patience of something that had been alive perhaps since before there were men to be afraid of it. I stood the first watch with Tommy Bright. The boy was calm. Was Ray. Calmer than I was, if I'm honest. "Mr. Pardo," he said, after we had been standing in silence for perhaps an hour, "do you think it's the only one?" The question had not occurred to me. I wished he had not asked it. "I don't know, Tommy. Because if there's one, there must be more. Things that large don't exist alone. They need others to breed. Tommy, I don't think this is the time for natural philosophy." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I keep thinking about Grace, about her shell. You'll find her a shell in Kingston." "I know, I just keep thinking about it." He paused. "The ocean's a lot bigger than I thought, Mr. Pardo. That's all. When I signed on, I thought the sea was just water, just something you crossed to get somewhere else. I didn't think about what might be in it. Most people don't. Maybe that's better." He looked down at the dark water. "Maybe it's better not to know." I think about that conversation often. About Tommy Bright, 20 years old, standing in the dark with a musket that would not have scratched the paint on a frigate, let alone harmed the thing below us. About his sister's letter in his shirt pocket. About the wooden shell he was carving that I later found abandoned on the foredeck, with the knife still beside it, half finished, smooth where his hands had been. About what happened to him the next day. At 4 bells in the middle watch, approximately 2 in the morning, the creature announced its intentions. The first blow came from below. Not a ram, not a bite, a bump, the way a cat nudges something with its nose before deciding whether to kill it. But this nudge lifted the Porsche's stern 3 feet out of the water and dropped her back with a crack that split the planking on the quarterdeck and sent every man not holding a rope sprawling across the boards. Before anyone could stand, the second blow came. Harder. The port side this time, amidships. The hull flexed inward with a sound like a great drum being struck, and the copper sheathing screamed as something massive scraped along it from bow to stern. The ship rolled 15 degrees to starboard, then 20, and hung there for a long, sickening moment before righting herself. Then, silence. The lantern swung wildly. Men pulled themselves up, bleeding from where they'd struck timber. Somewhere below, water was coming in. I could hear it, a rushing sound, deep in the hull, the sound of the sea finding a way inside. "Pumps!" Aldous shouted. "All hands to the pumps!" But the pumps were not what saved us that night. What saved us was that the creature stopped. It struck us twice and then withdrew. I do not know why. Perhaps it was testing, as Tommy had suggested. Perhaps the copper sheathing tasted wrong. Perhaps it simply was not hungry yet. I have spent 52 years wondering, and I have no answer that satisfies. What I do know is that when dawn came and we inspected the damage, we found the hole. 9 feet across, just above the waterline on the port side, where the hull planking had been staved in and 3 timbers snapped clean through. The edges of the breach were scored with parallel grooves, deep and regular, spaced approximately 2 inches apart. Tooth marks, and buried in the remaining timber, driven through 4 inches of English oak, the tooth. The one that sits on my desk now, as I write this. We spent the morning making repairs. The carpenter, a man named Hobson, worked without pause for 6 hours, fitting planks and caulking seams while the pumps ran continuously. The damage was survivable, but only just. If the creature struck lower, below the waterline, we would go down in minutes. Every man aboard knew this. Nobody said it. At midday, the wind returned. A light breeze from the northeast, barely enough to fill the sails, but it was movement. Aldous set every stitch of canvas we had and pointed us southwest toward the nearest land, which was the island of Bermuda, perhaps 400 miles distant. The creature followed. We could see it now in daylight when the sun was right, a shadow beneath the surface, keeping pace off our port quarter at a distance of perhaps 100 yards. Sometimes closer. Sometimes it would surge forward until its head was alongside our hull, and through the clear water I could see the eye again, that black disc the size of a barrelhead, watching. Then it would fall back and take up its station astern, and we would breathe again until the next time. It was Ennis who noticed the pattern. "It's hurting us," he said, standing beside me at the taffrail. "Watch. Every time we adjust course to the north, it moves to block. It only gives us room to the south and west." He was right. The creature was driving us, not toward Bermuda, toward deeper water. Away from the shallows, the reefs, the places where a ship could find refuge in water too thin for something of that size to follow. Aldous tried to fight it. He ordered to turn to the north, hard. The creature responded within minutes, surging up from below and passing directly beneath us, so close the keel scraped along its back. The contact lasted perhaps 3 seconds. The sound was extraordinary, a grinding, rasping vibration that traveled through the hull and into the soles of our feet and up through our bones. Several men fell to their knees. One, a young sailor named Marsh, vomited over the rail. We turned back to the southwest. The creature fell back to its station, patient, unhurried, guiding us like a sheepdog guides a flock. That evening, it took Peter Oakes. I have to tell this plainly because I owe Peter that much. He was at the port rail, emptying the slop bucket from the galley. He had done this 1,000 times on 100 voyages. It was the most routine act imaginable. He leaned over the rail with the bucket, and the sea erupted. I did not see the creature's body. I saw only the head, the jaws. They came out of the water vertically, rising alongside the hull like a cliff face of gray-white flesh and teeth, and the mouth opened. And I understood then what the naturalists meant when they wrote that the ancient sharks could have swallowed a horse cart. The jaws were a cavern. The teeth were rows of white triangles, each one the size of a man's hand, hundreds of them, set in gums the color of raw meat. The jaws closed around Peter Oakes and 3 feet of the port rail and a section of the bulwark. The wood exploded into splinters. Peter did not scream. I do not think he had time. One moment he was there, a heavy-set Welshman holding a slop bucket, thinking perhaps of his wife's roses. The next he was gone, and the creature was sliding back into the water with a section of our ship in its mouth, and the sea closed over it like a wound healing. The whole thing took less than 2 seconds. Carl Whitfield was standing 6 feet from where Peter had been. He was soaked in spray and trembling. He looked at the gap in the rail, the splintered wood, the empty air where his friend had stood. He looked at his hands. They were red. Not with his own blood. He did not speak for 2 days. We lost Thomas Bright the following morning, the 17th of October, and his death is the one I cannot think about without my hands beginning to shake, even now, even after all these years. The creature had not struck again after taking Oakes. It circled, it waited, and then, in the gray light before dawn, it changed its approach. It began to bump the hull again, not hard, rhythmic, gentle almost, a steady percussion that rocked the ship in a slow, horrible cradle, and with each bump, the damaged section of the hull worked a little looser, and the water in the bilge rose another inch. Tommy was in the hold with Hobson, trying to shore up the breach from inside when the planking gave way. I was on deck. I heard the crack. Then the rush of water, the same sound I had heard 2 nights before, but louder, closer, more final. Then screaming. Then Hobson came up through the hatch, white-faced, water streaming from his clothes. And when I looked past him into the darkness of the hold, I saw the sea pouring in through a gap in the hull that was now 5 feet across, and in that gap, filling it, pressing against it, was the creature's snout. It had pushed its way into the breach. Its head was inside our ship. Tommy was in the water, chest deep and rising. He was trying to reach the hatch, but the current pouring through the breach was pulling him backward, toward the gap, toward the thing that waited on the other side. I reached down through the hatch. Our hands met. I gripped his wrist. He gripped mine. His eyes found my face, and in them I saw the full and terrible understanding of what was about to happen. "Tell Grace," he said. The current took him. His wrist pulled through my fingers, slick with water and blood from where the splintered timbers had torn his palms. I held on. God knows I held on. I squeezed until my knuckles went white and my shoulders screamed and the tendons in my forearms stood out like ropes. His hand slipped free. The water pulled him down and back through the breach, and the last I saw of Thomas Bright was his face, his young, frightened face, and his hand reaching for mine. And then the dark water closed over him, and the creature withdrew its head from the hull, and the sea rushed in to fill the space where both of them had been. I have never told Grace. I have wanted to many times over many years. But what could I say? What words exist for what I saw? She grew up. She married. She lives in Bristol still, I'm told. She never got her pink shell. I'm not going to describe in detail the hours that followed, because I find that I cannot. The creature struck twice more. We lost 2 more men, pulled from the deck by jaws that rose without warning and retreated without pause. Aldous rallied us. Ennis fought like a man possessed, firing musket after musket into the water, and perhaps 1 ball in 20 struck the creature, and those that did bounced off its hide like pebbles off a stone wall. What saved the surviving 19 of us was a squall. It came up from the south in the late afternoon, a black wall of wind and rain that hit us like a fist. The seas went from calm to 15 feet in half an hour. The Portia, damaged and taking water, wallowed and groaned, but the storm drove us north, toward shallower water, toward the Bermuda Shelf, where the seafloor rises from 2 miles to 200 feet in the space of a few leagues. The creature followed for perhaps an hour. Then, as the water beneath us lightened from black to blue, it fell back. I was at the stern when I saw it turn, the whole massive body rolling in the storm swell, showing for one moment its full length against a wave face. I saw the tail. I had not seen the tail before. The distance from the head to the tip of that great vertical fin was, by my best estimate, 90 feet. Perhaps more. The body was thick and powerful, tapered at both ends, and it moved through the storm surge with an ease that made the 15-foot seas look like ripples in a pond. It turned south, toward the deep water, and it descended, and we never saw it again. We limped into St. George's Harbor, Bermuda, on the 19th of October with 4 feet of water in the hold and every man aboard working the pumps in shifts. The harbor authorities accepted our story of storm damage. They did not ask about the tooth marks in the hull, or if they noticed them, they chose not to inquire. 5 men dead: Peter Oakes, Thomas Bright, James Marsh, Edward Cole, William Fenwick. 5 men who had left Bristol with plans and families and expectations of return. Captain Aldous filed his report with the ship's owners in Bristol. It described storm damage and the loss of 5 crew members to heavy seas. It made no mention of the creature. When I asked him why, he looked at me with exhaustion that went deeper than the physical. Because they would call us mad, he said, and they would be wrong, but it would not matter. The report would be buried. The ship would be sold, and every man who sailed on her would carry the mark of lunacy for the rest of his career. He paused. The dead are dead, William. I cannot help them. I can still help the living. He was right, of course, and he was wrong. The living carried wounds that no practical consideration could heal. Aldous retired from the sea within the year. He bought a small house in Clifton and lived quietly, and when I visited him in 1789, he had aged 20 years and 8. His hands shook. He drank more than was wise. He told me he could not bear the sound of water against a hull, that it brought back the rhythmic bumping in the dark, and that he sometimes woke in the night, certain that the floor beneath his bed was flexing inward. He died in 1792. His doctor called it a failure of the heart. Ennis went back to sea because the sea was all he knew. He sailed for another 15 years and never spoke of what happened. I learned from a mutual acquaintance that he kept a loaded pistol in his cabin on every subsequent voyage, and that he was seen on several occasions standing at the taffrail in the middle watch, staring into the wake with an expression that the acquaintance described as waiting. He was lost overboard in 1796, somewhere in the Bay of Biscay. The ship's log recorded it as an accident. No one who knew him believed that. Carl Whitfield went home to Falmouth. He never sailed again. He took a job in a chandler's shop and raised his son Daniel, and never once took the boy to sea, despite Daniel's pleading. He told Daniel the ocean was no place for a man who wanted to grow old. Daniel became a school teacher. Carl died in his bed in 1811, which is more than most of us could hope for, though his wife told me in a letter that he never slept through a full night again. He would wake gasping, she said, and sit in the dark and hold the little brass compass his son had made, turning it over and over in his hands until dawn. I am the last. 81 years old, in a room in Portsmouth with a tooth on my desk and a rattle in my chest, and the memory of Tommy Bright's hand sliding through mine. I tried for years to make someone listen. I wrote to the Royal Society. I wrote to the Admiralty. I showed them the tooth. They admired it as a curiosity and suggested it was a fossil, found perhaps on a beach, worked perhaps by native craftsmen into a shape resembling a tooth. When I insisted it had been pulled from the hull of a living ship, driven there by a living jaw, they smiled the way you smile at a man who has confused his memories with his imagination. The tooth is not a fossil. I have held fossils. They are stone. This is bone. It has the grain of living tissue, the weight of something that grew in a living mouth. But I have given up trying to convince anyone of that. I am not telling this as a warning. The Atlantic is vast, and the deep places in it are beyond our reach and our understanding, and whatever lives there will continue to live there, regardless of what one dying man writes in a room in Portsmouth. I am not telling this to be believed. I gave up on belief decades ago. I am telling this because 5 men died, and the world recorded their deaths as weather, because Peter Oakes deserved better than a line in a ledger, because Tommy Bright reached for my hand, and I could not hold on, and his sister never learned why her brother didn't come home, because the truth is heavier than a 3-pound tooth, and I am tired of carrying it alone. The ocean is deeper than we know, older than we imagine, and the things that move through its darkness are not obligated to conform to our understanding of what is possible. I held Tommy's hand. The water took him. I'm an old man now, and my lungs are failing. When I close my eyes, I see his face below the surface, his mouth open, his hand still reaching upward through dark water toward a grip that was no longer there. That is what I carry. That is what I have always carried. Make of it what you will.